History is rarely as clean as the stories we tell about it. Nations speak of loyalty, alliances, and shared sacrifice, but when survival is on the line, those ideals are often tested in ways that leave uncomfortable questions behind. This is a journey through 5 moments when Britain, under immense pressure, made decisions that have since been labeled by some as abandonment. Were these betrayals or brutal necessities? We begin at number 5. In early 1941, the world was already engulfed in the chaos of World War II. Nazi Germany had swept across Europe with terrifying speed, and the Balkans became the next critical front. Greece, defiant and already resisting Italian forces, suddenly faced the full might of Adolf Hitler's war machine. The stakes were clear. If Greece fell, Germany would secure a strategic foothold in southeastern Europe and threaten British positions in the Mediterranean. Britain responded. In a show of commitment, roughly 60,000 British and Commonwealth troops were deployed to Greece. It was a bold move, one that carried both military risk and political symbolism. Britain wanted to demonstrate that it stood by its allies, that aggression would not go unanswered. But beneath the surface, the situation was far more fragile than it appeared. British commanders knew the odds were not in their favor. German forces were faster, better coordinated, and supported by overwhelming air superiority. The terrain, though rugged, could not compensate for the imbalance in strength. Almost as soon as British troops arrived, the German invasion began in April 1941, and it moved with devastating efficiency. Within weeks, the reality became undeniable. The defensive lines collapsed, communications faltered, retreat became unavoidable. And then came the decision. Rather than risk total destruction, Britain ordered a full evacuation. In a desperate operation, thousands of troops were pulled out by sea, escaping to Crete and Egypt. It was, in purely military terms, a successful withdrawal, tens of thousands of soldiers saved from capture or death. But success has many faces. For Greece, the consequences were immediate and brutal. With British forces gone, Greek troops were left to face the German advance alone. Resistance continued, but it was no longer a coordinated Allied effort. By the end of April, mainland Greece had fallen under Axis control, ushering in years of harsh occupation, famine, and resistance warfare. To critics, this moment has long been framed as abandonment, a powerful ally stepping in just long enough to make a statement, only to withdraw when the situation turned dire. The image is stark. British ships leaving Greek shores, while the country they came to defend stood on the brink of collapse. But the reality is more complex. Britain, in 1941, was fighting for survival on multiple fronts. The threat of invasion at home still loomed. Resources were stretched thin across North Africa, the Atlantic, and the skies above Britain itself. Holding Greece at all costs might have meant losing far more elsewhere. So the question lingers, was this a betrayal of an ally, or a calculated sacrifice in a much larger war? What makes this moment so compelling is not just the decision itself, but the tension between intention and outcome. Britain did act. It did send troops. It did attempt to resist the German advance. But when faced with overwhelming force, it chose preservation over persistence. And in doing so, it left behind a nation to face one of the darkest chapters in its history. This is only the beginning. Because as we move up the list, the stakes grow higher, the decisions more controversial, and the consequences far more far-reaching. If Greece was a retreat under fire, the next case is something far colder, decided not on the battlefield, but at a negotiating table. It's 1938. Europe stands on the edge of war, but it hasn't fallen in yet. The scars of World War I are still fresh, and the appetite for another catastrophic conflict is almost non-existent, especially in Britain. The priority is clear: avoid war at all costs. At the center of the crisis is Czechoslovakia, a young but strategically vital state in Central Europe. Its border regions, the Sudetenland, are home to a large ethnic German population. Adolf Hitler seizes on this as a pretext, demanding the territory be handed over to Germany. Czechoslovakia refuses. And here's where the situation becomes critical. France has a formal alliance with Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union signals potential support. And Britain, while not bound by treaty, holds enormous influence over how the crisis will unfold. Enter Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain believes he can prevent war through negotiation. He meets Hitler multiple times, convinced that satisfying limited territorial demands will stabilize Europe. The result is the infamous Munich Agreement. The terms are simple and devastating. The Sudetenland will be ceded to Germany. No war, no resistance, no vote from Czechoslovakia itself. In fact, Czechoslovakia is not even invited to the negotiations that decide its fate. From Britain's perspective, this is a diplomatic victory. Chamberlain returns home declaring he has secured peace for our time. Crowds cheer. War, it seems, has been avoided. But the illusion doesn't last. Strategically, the Sudetenland is not just territory. It contains Czechoslovakia's main defensive fortifications, industrial base, and natural border protections. Once handed over, the country is left exposed, vulnerable, and effectively defenseless. Within months, in March 1939, Hitler breaks his promises and occupies the rest of Czechoslovakia without resistance. No negotiations, no agreements, just complete control. For many historians, this moment stands as one of the clearest examples of abandonment, not through retreat, but through consent. Britain and France didn't just fail to defend an ally, they actively facilitated the dismantling of a sovereign state in the hope of preserving peace. But again, context matters. In 1938, Britain is not ready for war. Its military is underprepared, its air defenses still developing. The trauma of World War I looms over every decision. Chamberlain is not trying to betray Czechoslovakia, he is trying to buy time. And in a narrow sense, he succeeds. The extra year allows Britain to accelerate rearmament, strengthen the Royal Air Force, and prepare for the conflict that would inevitably come. When war does break out in 1939, Britain is in a far stronger position than it would have been a year earlier. So was this a cowardly concession or a necessary delay? To Czechoslovakia, the answer is painfully clear. The country was sacrificed without a voice, its fate decided by powers that chose negotiation over commitment. And the consequences didn't just reshape one nation, they emboldened Hitler, proving that aggression could succeed without immediate consequence. The pattern is beginning to emerge. Not always a sudden abandonment in the heat of battle, but sometimes a quiet decision made far from the front lines where the cost is borne entirely by someone else. And next, we move to a moment where Britain does declare war in defense of an ally. But what follows may be even more controversial. By 1939, the lessons of the previous year were impossible to ignore. Appeasement had failed, agreements had been broken, and when Adolf Hitler turned his attention to Poland, Britain drew a line it claimed would not be crossed. This time, there would be no Munich. In March 1939, Britain issued a formal guarantee to Poland. If its sovereignty was threatened, Britain would come to its aid. It was a powerful statement, one meant not just for Warsaw, but for Berlin. The message was clear: further aggression would mean war. And on September 1st, 1939, that war began. German forces invaded Poland with overwhelming speed and precision. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, unleashed tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry in a coordinated assault that shattered defensive lines within days. Poland fought back fiercely, mobilizing its army and resisting on multiple fronts. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. On paper, the promise had been kept, but on the ground in Poland, nothing changed. No British troops arrived, no major offensive was launched in the West, no significant air support disrupted the German advance. While Poland was fighting for survival, Britain's role remained largely symbolic in the early weeks of the conflict. Then came the second blow. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east under a secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Caught between two superpowers, Poland's fate was sealed. By early October, after just 5 weeks of brutal fighting, Poland was defeated. Its territory was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Its government fled into exile. Its people entered one of the darkest occupations in modern history, and Britain was still preparing. This period would later be known as the Phony War, a strange, quiet phase on the Western Front where war had been declared, but little actual fighting occurred. British forces mobilized, defenses were strengthened, plans were drawn up, but no decisive action was taken to relieve pressure on Poland. To many, this felt like the clearest contradiction yet. Britain had gone to war specifically to defend Poland, yet when the moment came, it could not deliver meaningful military support. The guarantee, though sincere in intent, proved hollow in execution. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Britain was not in a position to save Poland in 1939. Geography alone made direct intervention nearly impossible. There was no practical way to send large ground forces into Eastern Europe quickly enough to matter. The British military, still recovering from years of underinvestment, lacked the readiness for a major continental offensive, and France, Poland's other key ally, hesitated to launch a full-scale attack into Germany. So Britain chose a different path. Instead of immediate rescue, it committed to a long war, one that would eventually defeat Germany, but not in time to save Poland from its initial fate. And that distinction matters, because from a strategic perspective, Britain did act. It declared war. It committed its entire national effort to the defeat of Nazi Germany. It did not negotiate, did not concede, did not delay. But from Poland's perspective, the outcome was the same. They stood alone. The fall of Poland marked the true beginning of World War II in Europe. It exposed the brutal reality that declarations and guarantees mean little without the ability to enforce them. And it revealed a recurring theme in Britain's wartime decisions, intentions shaped by principle but constrained by capability. Still, the story doesn't end there, because next we move to one of the most famous moments of the war, often remembered as a miracle, a triumph, a symbol of resilience. But beneath that story lies another side, one that asks a difficult question. When survival demands sacrifice, who gets left behind? By mid-1940, the war had turned into a disaster for the Allies. German forces had stormed through Belgium and northern France with terrifying speed, outmaneuvering everything in their path. The British Expeditionary Force, alongside French and Belgian troops, was suddenly cut off, trapped against the English Channel near the small port of Dunkirk. What followed would become one of the most iconic moments of World War II, the Dunkirk evacuation. Over the course of just 9 days, between May 26th and June 4th, an extraordinary rescue effort unfolded. Naval vessels, merchant ships, and even civilian boats crossed the channel under constant threat of German air attacks. Against all odds, around 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated to Britain. It was called a miracle, and in many ways it was. But like many moments in history, the full picture is more complicated. Behind the triumph lies a quieter, far less celebrated reality. As the evacuation progressed, priorities became unavoidable. The British command made a clear decision. British troops would be evacuated first. French forces, who had fought alongside them and were still holding defensive positions to protect the retreat, were largely left to the final stages of evacuation. Time ran out. When the operation ended, over 40,000 French soldiers were still on the beaches or defending the perimeter. They were captured by advancing German forces, sent into years of imprisonment as prisoners of war. From one perspective, this was a necessary choice. Britain was facing a potential invasion. Its army, what remained of it, was essential for defending the homeland. Losing the core of its military in France could have meant total collapse. Saving as many British troops as possible wasn't just strategy, it was survival. And to be fair, thousands of French soldiers were evacuated. The operation was not exclusively British. Cooperation existed, and sacrifices were shared. But perception matters. For many in France, Dunkirk became a symbol not just of British resilience, but of British self-preservation at the expense of an ally. French troops had held the line, buying time for evacuation, only to find themselves among the last to leave, if they left at all. It's a tension that lingers in how the story is told. In Britain, Dunkirk is remembered as a heroic escape, a moment when determination and unity overcame impossible odds. In France, it carries a more bittersweet tone, marked by both bravery and abandonment, and both perspectives are true. Because Dunkirk was never a clean victory. It was a retreat, a desperate, necessary, life-saving retreat, but a retreat nonetheless. Equipment was abandoned, positions were surrendered, and not everyone made it out. The question, once again, is not whether Britain acted, but how it chose to act when faced with impossible decisions. Who gets saved first? Who holds the line? And who is left behind when time runs out? These are not questions with easy answers. In war, every decision carries a cost, and sometimes that cost is measured not in strategy, but in trust. Now we arrive at the final entry. Not a battlefield withdrawal, not a diplomatic compromise, but something far more enduring. A decision made at the very end of the war that would shape the fate of an entire nation for decades to come. The war in Europe was coming to an end. After years of destruction, sacrifice, and relentless war, Nazi Germany stood on the brink of collapse. Allied forces were closing in from both west and east. Victory was no longer a question of if, but when. And at the center of the final decisions shaping post-war Europe stood three men: Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. In February 1945, they met at the Yalta Conference. Officially, the goal was simple: plan the post-war order and ensure lasting peace. But beneath the surface, the real negotiations were about power, who would control what remained after the war ended. And once again, Poland was at the center. This is where the story comes full circle. Britain had entered the war in 1939 because of Poland. It had pledged to defend Polish sovereignty. It had framed the entire conflict in part as a stand against aggression toward that nation. But by 1945, the situation had fundamentally changed. The Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the war on the Eastern Front, suffering millions of casualties while pushing German forces back toward Berlin. As a result, Soviet troops now occupied most of Eastern Europe, including Poland itself. That reality mattered more than any earlier promise. At Yalta, Stalin made his position clear: Poland would fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. A pro-Soviet government would be established, borders would be redrawn, control would not be negotiated, it would be enforced. And Britain agreed. Churchill pushed for concessions, free elections, some level of independence, but the leverage simply wasn't there. The Red Army was already on the ground. The Western Allies were not in a position to challenge Soviet control without risking a new war, one they had no desire to fight. So a compromise was reached. Poland would be free, on paper. In reality, it would become a Soviet-aligned state for decades to come. For the Polish government in exile, which had fought alongside the Allies throughout the war, this was a devastating outcome. They were effectively sidelined, replaced by a regime backed by Moscow. The very independence Britain had once vowed to protect was no longer part of the final equation. To many, this stands as the most profound example of abandonment on this list. Not in the chaos of battle, not under immediate threat, but at the moment of victory. After everything, after the declarations, the paterasmi, the sacrifices, Poland did not emerge as a fully sovereign nation in the way it had hoped. Instead, it found itself behind what would soon be known as the Iron Curtain. But again, the deeper question remains: what choice did Britain truly have? By 1945, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The Soviet Union was not just an ally, it was a dominant force in Europe. Challenging Stalin's demands could have fractured the alliance before the war even officially ended, potentially prolonging conflict or igniting a new one. Churchill faced a brutal reality: uphold earlier promises and risk another catastrophic war, or accept a compromised peace. He chose the latter, and in doing so, closed the final chapter of this story. Because across all 5 moments, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Britain did not always walk away out of indifference or betrayal. More often, it acted under pressure, choosing survival, strategy, or long-term positioning over immediate loyalty. But for those on the other side of those decisions, the outcome often felt the same: left alone, left exposed, left behind. History rarely offers simple judgments, only consequences.